Good morning, everyone. Welcome to CBA's Unbound Book Review. And this morning we are fortunate to have David Bosworth here, and we are going to be reviewing creation and emotion in the Old Testament. So welcome, David. We also have with us Dr. Richard Clifford and Dr. Christopher Frechette, who will be our panelists in reviewing the book. Um, Dr. David Bosworth has taught at Catholic University since 2008. He earned his BA in Liberal Studies through the Great Books program at St. John's College in Annapolis in 1994 and earned his PhD in 2003 at Catholic University of America. His research and teaching interests include the Old Testament in its ancient Near Eastern context and biblical conceptualizations of the human being and emotion in the Bible. He teaches courses on the human person and the church, which draws on his interests in biblical anthropology and American Catholic history. He is currently researching biblical conceptualizations of the human being. Dr. Richard Clifford is Professor Emeritus of Old Testament at Boston College Clough School of Theology and Ministry. He has served there since 2008. He is a graduate of Boston College and Western Jesuit School of Theology, in which he received his STL. He received his PhD at Harvard University. He has served as the general editor of our very own CBQ and also president of CBA and president of Western Jesuit School of Theology. He was also the founding dean of Boston College School of Theology and Ministry from 2008 to 2010. He has many recent prestigious publications that are too numerous to mention. And Dr. Christopher Frechette is formerly Assistant Professor of Old Testament from 2008 to 2014 and currently visiting scholar 2022 to present at Boston College Clough School of Theology and Ministry. Christopher earned his PhD in Old Testament from Harvard in 2005. He has multiple publications in the area of trauma hermeneutics, including co-editor of Bible Through the Lens of Trauma from Simia Studies 86. He is currently a licensed independent clinical social worker in private practice providing individual and group psychotherapy focusing on childhood trauma. Welcome to you all. This morning, the author and the panelists will be reflecting on this work with these two questions in mind. How do images and depictions of physical creation express emotion in ancient Jewish literature? And how does emotion represented in texts integrate the person and shape behavior of the person? So first, we're going to go to David, and David is going to give us a brief introduction of the volume, and then we'll follow with our two panelists. So David, I turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you for this invitation. I thought I'd begin by giving some, I guess, some background information on sort of where this project came from or how it started. So I've been researching for quite a while. I guess my central question has been, what is a human being? And to my way of thinking, that to think about that question, I sort of have to learn about social sciences. So I've been doing a lot of correlating, I guess, biblical text and social scientific research. And one of the things that has struck me most in the social scientific research um, is how social humans are. So it's kind of a truism. Humans are social animals. But I'm struck at, for example, modern psychology is which has a very individualistic bias, but kind of the more psychologists delve into what is an individual, what they find is a community of people. So even the individual has kind of a social origin, and that we are social in ways far more significant or profound than we generally imagine. Um, so this project emerged out of my previous work. For several years, I focused on weeping, a very specific thing that was a strategic choice, largely to kind of discern, I guess, the relationship between our biological and cultural nature as humans. Um, So, I mean, weeping is clearly a biological behavior, but there's a lot of cultural and individual variability about who weeps when, under what circumstances, that kind of thing. And that work on weeping led inevitably to certainly involved emotion, because the interesting thing about weeping is that humans cry for emotional reasons, and we're the only species on the planet that does that. Um, so that got me interested in emotions, most obviously, especially grief, but also love, joy, fear. What this current book, Creation and Emotion in the Old Testament, sort of expands this work in a few different directions. So I should mention, first of all, sort of a thank you to the CPA, because the most productive period of research for this book was made possible by a grant from the CBA, which I got a research leave in the fall of 2020. And as it turned out, you might recall that the fall of 2020 was a really good semester to not have to teach um, with all that was going on. So first, in terms of expanding my work, this book encompasses a wider range of emotions. So there are 10 emotions in 5 chapters that I'll come to briefly in a moment. It further develops the social aspect of human nature, that again, we're social creatures, and it's not just that we're social with other humans, but we're social with not the non-human world. So everything from we have pets, we have relationships with other animals, to we have emotional relationships with sort of inanimate nature, with water, waterfalls. I was at a conference in San Diego recently, and when I checked in, the hotel offered if I wanted to pay more money, I could have a bayfront view, which I opted not to do. But the point is that humans are so drawn to that kind of thing that they will pay extra money for that view. So we have this emotional responsiveness to the environment, the created world around us. And a third thing that developed during that fall of 2020 was a much deeper dive for me into cognitive linguistics. So understanding if you understand what a human being is, then it becomes important to understand language. And if you want to interpret ancient texts, then it becomes important to understand language. So one of the key points, I guess, is that there's not a one-to-one correspondence between words and concepts. So utterances sort of gesture toward concepts in the mind, but there's not a straightforward one-to-one correspondence, which means that emotions are present in texts, present in speech, even if emotion words are not present. So often a lot of past research in emotion in the Bible is often focused on emotion words, but emotion words might be missing even when emotion is very salient. So like just one example, when David hides in the cave in 1 Samuel 24, it's never said that he's afraid. But it's hard to imagine that we're not supposed to understand him as afraid in that situation, with hiding in his cave with his men, with Saul sort of blocking the entrance with his army outside. A psalmist or some editor adds a superscription to Psalm 142 referencing this exact episode of David in the cave. And that psalm is very evocative and expressive of fear, but never uses a word for fear. It does use a word for distress. It talks about isolation, a lack of a safe place, being a prisoner, has lots of language and imagery, never mentions fear because it doesn't have to. So that kind of led me to kind of looking at these emotions, I guess the relationship between human emotions and sort of the created order in the Hebrew Bible. And so the 5 chapters are sort of pairs of emotions. So love and grief, for various reasons, go well together. So that sort of love for Jerusalem, often expressed as a mother, like Mother Zion. And then grief, a good example that was in the book is Jeremiah 14. So we see the grief as well as some shame and guilt that enters in when people experience drought, not only the fear of what the future may hold in the absence of food, but also a sense of shame or guilt because of the belief that the drought is a consequence of some kind of sinful human behavior. And then chapter 2 takes on surprise and fear that are kind of closely related. So the day of the Lord is a good example of both of these things. So the day of the Lord in Isaiah or Amos is described as something surprising and terrifying. And very often things like the sun darkening, the earth shaking are both expressing God's wrath and eliciting human fear. A different kind of surprise occurs in places where the Bible reflects on the obedience of animals, that animals follow their instincts and obey God, while humans are these perverse things that don't obey in the way that other animals do. And there's kind of an amazement of this contrast between the obedience of animals and the rebellion of humans. The 3rd chapter tackles disgust and anger. So, for example, the vineyard song in Isaiah 5 ends with a sort of disgusting fruit of this vineyard. And that disgusting fruit is sort of a metaphor for the disgusting behaviors, the immoral behaviors of the people of Judah. And similarly, in Exodus, there's a way in which there's both a physical and moral disgust as a theme in Exodus. Some of the plagues are just disgusting. They're not so much destructive as they are just gross. And the people of Israel, the Hebrews, are regarded by Pharaoh as disgusting, or as put in Hebrew, stinky. Like the people complain to Moses, "You have made us stinky or smell bad in the eyes of Pharaoh," and that leads to Pharaoh's more severe punishments. And chapter 4 looks at pride and shame. Again, a nice sort of pairing. Like Isaiah 14, for example, you've got the king of Babylon wanting to set up his throne above the stars of God, but he's going to be cast down in the lowest pits of Sheol. So there's a way in which the structure of creation, high and low, our experience of gravity, maps many things, including pride and shame, that pride is up and shame is down, and humiliation is being cast down. And similarly, in Psalm 69, is a psalm sort of about the experience of shame expressed as sinking into mud and water, again, of downward motion. And people who feel ashamed often reflect the desire that they could disappear or sort of sink into the earth. In the fifth and final chapter on joy and awe, so Isaiah has a lot of passages about the blooming desert. The desert's going to be flowing with water, and all these plants will bloom as Israel is restored. So you have sort of creation is being transformed in a positive way at the same time that Israel is being restored to its former glory, and creation itself is rejoicing as the people rejoice. There is also in Isaiah some evocation of awe that I discuss more in relationship to Job and the divine speech is at the end of Job. One of Job's responses, his first response to the first divine speech, is often translated, "I'm of little account." What he literally says is, "I am small." And in a nutshell, that's kind of what awe is. So awe is described as an experience of vastness in the incapacity to cope with that vastness. So Job feels very tiny when confronted by God. Um, and it's not that God is trying to humiliate him so much as God is trying to evoke awe in him, because positive emotions like awe and joy have the power to undo negative emotions. That if Job is sort of stuck in a grief and trauma and desperation, that God asking him questions draws his attention elsewhere and tries to fill him with some sense of awe and wonder. And that awe, in making you feel small, can also sort of destroy your existing sort of intellectual concepts and opens up Job to the possibility of a future different than what he expects. And second Isaiah has similar rhetoric to try to turn people around from a kind of sorrow, desperation, or depression into a kind of awe and joy to elicit hope. Um, that is the book in very short terms. As things wanted to stress, partly the socialness, the social nature of human beings is so intense. We're so social that we form relationships with things that are probably not really people, like whether it's pets or whether it's inanimate nature. And sort of moving forward, I'm still very interested in emotion, but turning more towards the wider topic of biblical anthropology. In other words, sort of again the root question of what is a human being, and how do the biblical writers conceptualize or construe what a human being is, and how do they understand human experience. So behind me are a bunch of books here in German on biblical anthropology, because for some reason it's a very German-dominated field. But if you're interested in what a human being is, then it strikes me that you have to be interested in emotion, because emotions do sort of integrate and shape our behavior. And we use language to do all kinds of things. We use language to direct people's attention in certain ways and therefore to elicit certain emotions in people. So if somebody is successful in making you feel the thing that they want you to feel, there's a very good chance that they will succeed in getting you to do the thing that they want you to do, because emotions integrate our behavior, they motivate us. And so these descriptions in biblical and other descriptions or discourse about the environment, physical creation, are not emotionally inert. They're emotionally charged. And whether that's describing the sun darkening, the earth shaking is charged in a way that evokes fear or negative emotion, or whether it's depicting the desert blooming to evoke joy and more positive emotion, And even things that may seem more inert, like I just talk about bunny rabbits, and people think they're awfully cute, and they smile and feel good because, oh, rabbits. So even things where you're not necessarily trying very hard to elicit emotion, simply talking about elements of creation do that, because it is not, I guess, emotionally inert, but it's the world, the environment is emotionally charged. And so writers and speakers use the emotional charge of the environment to elicit emotion and therefore behavior. So it might be a lot with this. Hopefully, it's a helpful introduction. But thank you.
All right, thank you, David. Appreciate that very much for a great introduction. So we'll turn to our first respondent, Dick Clifford. So Dick, I turn it over to you. Unmute yourself, Dick.
Mute myself. First, I want to congratulate David on his book. It tackles a topic that is seldom assessed and hard to pin down, as I think we got from his own introduction. Emotions portrayed in the Old Testament. And it also deals with another topic that is important to me, and I think also to David, that is creation, how to understand it and how to relate it to the topic of emotion. So the topics have been at times dealt with individually, but I think David's book brings them together in a way that's unusual and unique and very helpful. The book is very clearly argued. It teems with examples from the Bible, and I don't think anyone who even reads a couple of pages will quarrel with that. And it's enriched with a massive annotated bibliography that constitutes almost half the book. So I don't think you will be at a loss to continue reading on the topics that he has introduced. It's always worth asking, what is the discontent that led an author to write a book? What unsatisfactory perspective bugs an author, so to speak, and that the author wishes to correct that, what he considers wrong perspective. From reading the book, it's possible, I think, to discover the author's discontent and also the remedy that he is going to propose in his book. And William Brown puts it in his blurb on the cover. And to quote Brown, "The Bible makes no sense without understanding emotion, and the source of much emotion in the Bible comes from its various depictions of creation, from grief and fear to joy and so on." So I think that sums up much of what the discontent and its remedy that Bosworth wants us to look through. David believes that creation has not been adequately understood, and as a result, the emotions of created human characters in the Bible have not been sufficiently appreciated. His book upgrades our understanding of creation, and it also upgrades our study and understanding of the emotions of the humans that inhabit the world. He has boldly entered an arena where few scholars have trod, especially none in such detail, nor with an interest in how emotions are related to God's creation. In creating emotional human beings, God is revealed as himself, highly personal. With little fanfare, Bosworth moves quietly away from the classical and Western characterizations of God as omnipotent, omniscient, and impassible. These characterizations have profoundly influenced our own reading today of the Bible, at least our Christian reading, for over the centuries. From the beginning, Bosworth assumes a highly personal and emotional God, for God created human beings with the capacity to emote. I would like to develop further David's emphasis on God creating the universe and the humans who inhabit it. Scripture records God's deeds, and it records humans' response to those deeds. It means that God intended an emotional response of the creatures on earth. But first, we have to recognize the considerable differences between modern and ancient Near Eastern conceptions of creation. Modern definitions customarily explain the creation of the earth in scientific, impersonal terms. They focus on the universe of stars and galaxies, and they assign creation of the universe, the study of it anyway, to astral phenomena, to, in a sense, astronomy, versions of astronomy. Ancients, on the other hand, viewed creation in personal terms. It was the work of gods, whom they portray as all too human and personal, as we find in the satirical descriptions of the gods in Atrahasis. And they compare the act of creation to human acts of creation, such as building a city or building a building, or generating a child, giving birth to a child, or forming something from clay. Humans, that is to say. Or they also compare it to natural processes that are observable, like plants being renewed in the Nile as the waters recede and leave vegetation of these little mounds that persist. Ancients assumed the term of creation was not the astral system, and this is a very important point, and I think very supportive of David's thesis. They do not assume that creation was modeled on the astral system, as largely we do today, but they assume that the term of a creation, the goal of creation, what's left where after the creation has happened, is a human community. And accordingly, ancient creation accounts usually mention components of the human community, that is, kingship, language, in short, culture and crafts. These accompany creation because they see creation issuing in a human community, not in an astral system. So modern creation accounts, on the contrary, relegate such topics to paleoanthropology and history. They make it very impersonal, scientific, and forever reconstructible, or it can be approved as more data comes into the picture. So David stays within this very personal understanding of creation when he writes, "The present study explores how biblical writers combine creation and emotion." He argues that creation is place-based. God creates physical spaces that in turn give rise to human emotions that inhabit them. An example he gives, which is a very compelling one, is humans fear when they are thrown into a dark pit. Obviously, if you were thrown into a dark pit, you would know what fear is. And he associates emotion with place. In this case, fear is associated with a created place that somehow God has made. So God must be aware then that places give rise to emotional responses to the humans that God creates. Not only to illustrate with something that has struck me very vividly and still does from the Bible, that I think illustrate this and I think support David's position, although I don't think he uses it as I remember reading the book. And I would look at the Eden story in Genesis 2 and 3. And in looking at this, I would like to show how the depiction of physical creation express emotion in ancient Jewish literature, which is one of the points that Archie Wright singled out as a topic of concern for us today. How emotions shape how emotions are shaped by the creation. So it begins. The thing that strikes me about Genesis 2 and 3 is that God closely observes the man and adjusts his own response to the emotions that he sees observable in the man. For example, God looks at the man's emotion and concludes, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper as his partner." So God did not begin with that conclusion. God observed it and changed his mind according to how the man behaved. So God made the animals, and he brought them to the man to name, and that is to give a kind of to define the future relationship of animals to humans. But God kept on looking and learning about this new creature and found that animals did not assuage man's aloneness. So the aloneness continued despite the company of animals, observed perhaps in the man's restlessness and sadness, in short, in his emotions. So responding to the emotions that he saw in the man, we call Adam, God turned to another remedy, and that was to make a woman from man's body. And this really resolved the issue. And so God learned and adapted his own behavior from what he observed in the man's emotional state, which he read off from the way the man behaved in the garden. And I think that's a very important point. It makes it a little bit more, to me anyway, it's a fairly impressive illustration of the thesis that David is making in this book. The man can't be alone. He will not be satisfied with anything less than a woman is equal. What I find extraordinary is that God observes the man's emotional reaction to divine actions. In Bosworth's terms, the man is thrown into a new place, a garden, and God gauges the man's emotional reactions and addresses them by changing the place, in a broad sense, the place. The conclusion here is not only that the first human being has emotions that are observable, but that God respects, notices them, and adapts to them. One of the virtues of David's book is that it gives multiple examples of the passages to make his argument. The many, and here I would like to ask for maybe some clarification, but it may be that I'm not getting something that should be gotten rather quickly. I begin with a much deserved encomium in the book that I mentioned, Professor Brown's description of it. But I would like a little bit more clearly to know the underlying thesis and the rationale, especially the rationale for the polarities that David uses in describing the emotions such as love and grief, surprise and fear, disgust and anger, pride and shame, in particular, the last polarity, joy and awe, which differ from the preceding polarities in that both emotions are unquestionably positive. I will try now with a keen sense that I am perhaps imposing a question that the author did not consider essential in making his argument. But here goes in any case. Human emotion is generated by something concrete that is found. It's really found in the universe place. Humans are thrown into a space that seems of itself to generate an emotional reaction to them. Thus, the author is fully justified in linking creation, which consists of myriads of spaces, to human emotion. Creation conjures emotion. Creation conjures emotion is one of the leading sentences of the book at the beginning. The assertions at the beginning of the book make sense, but I find myself a bit puzzled as to the need of polarities, love and grief and so on, to establish the link between place and emotion. It may be that this is really David's way of developing his ideas by making them a little bit more complex and interesting by giving polarities. But I don't see the necessity of them, or if they are necessary, I would like to see a bit of an explanation of why they are necessary. But this is something that I probably should have got by reading, but I would like the author maybe to say it more explicitly himself. I don't see myself the persuasive power of paired emotions. I see the persuasive power of emotion. So I would ask the author to explain why he uses two emotions and how they function to reach the conclusion the book offers. In conclusion, I would like once again to congratulate the author on a fine book, well-researched and deeply rooted in the biblical text. It opens up a topic that is of interest and productivity, and it provides a methodology for studying. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Dick, for a very fine presentation and raising some good questions and make some good discussion coming up. So Christopher, turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation. I'm glad and honored to be here. I appreciate your book, David, and I really appreciate your comments, Dick. What I'm going to present is kind of using the two questions that were posed today to kind of as a stepping point into maybe a way of developing how further to think about the questions using more the foundation, actually the neurological system. So it's going to be a bit of an introduction to something most of us as Bible scholars may not be familiar with. So I'm going to try to present it clearly. So I'm going to put into the chat a bibliography, just in case people would find that helpful. So let me just find that real quick. So I just put a one-page, just select bibliography there, and then I'm going to share my PowerPoint. I felt that it's a little bit demanding in some ways, so I wanted to give people a frame of reference by looking at a PowerPoint. Okay, so getting unstuck from unsafety by dramatizing emotionally evocative biblical creation imagery. So I'm considering the two questions that are posed today. I want to first point out the complementarity of Professor Bosworth's book and John Levinson's Creation and the Persistence of Evil, the Jewish Drama of Divine Omnipotence. And from there, I want to consider how creation imagery enhances text's capacity to engage emotions in ways that cultivate a felt sense of well-being, integration, linked to encountering God. So different from, I'm glad that Dick provided such a very commentary focused on David's book. What I'm proposing is kind of maybe taking another step in where to go from what David has done. Okay, so what I want to say is both books highlight how acknowledgement of God's past creative activity fuels the community's participation in the presently unfolding creative activity of God. Moreover, both works highlight how the biblical text evokes people's experience of both awe and love in relating to God. So at the same time, the two works complement each other by their difference of focus. So Levinson maps a core belief structure that uses the concept of drama to link faithful Jewish practice to the people's confidence in God's ongoing protection of them from evil. So Levinson frames that drama within the relationship into which God continually draws Israel, a relationship that's charged with emotions of awe and love, as believers participate in the relationship with a blend of honest protest and trusting obedience. So Levinson emphasizes the importance of belief in theurgy, that is, the Israel's observance of Torah moves God to defeat and push back the forces of evil in the present, just as in the past, despite how those forces keep transgressing their boundaries, resulting in suffering. So David delves into the capacity of an array of textual creation images to engage the faithful hearers through a range of emotions, including awe and love, and so move them toward belief, trust, and behavior as envisioned in particular textual programs. He aims to demonstrate how biblical writers employed emotionally evocative images of physical creation in ways that facilitate hearers' faithful practice. They do so by both addressing existing emotional vulnerabilities, such as sadness and despair over prior suffering, and by building emotional capacity to participate in challenging social and ethical communal enterprises, such as the return to Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile. So again, both books highlight love and awe. So what do I want to do here? I'm bringing together Levinson's focus on drama and liturgy, and I would add what David just said about the radically social nature of being human, with also David's focus on the emotionally evocative capacity of creation imagery. What I want to do is consider in a brief and preliminary way how the dramatic enactment of that imagery, also in a social context, would have engaged the neurophysiological structure that underlies human emotion, effectively helping people to regulate their nervous systems in the wake of significant and even overwhelming threats. Now, so to do this, I'm drawing from the polyvagal theory, which was developed by Stephen Porges, first published in 1995. The theory explains how human bodies and brains work together to respond to both ordinary and overwhelming stressors. And it's received considerable support and has been integrated into a number or range of therapeutic approaches. And even if, given the complexity of the nervous system, more research is needed. So this is basically, I'm going to show you a couple charts to help understand what we're talking about. So the theory is the development of the nervous system begins early on with what's called the dorsal vagal, which is, reptiles have it. Under threat, you shut down, okay, or you get quiet. Building on that over time, there's the sympathetic nervous system, which is mobilization to fight or flight. Okay, and then finally you have this in all mammals, you have the social engagement system or the ventral vagal system. It's also called the relaxation state. So this gives you a sort of timeline of the three things. They go by some different names, which can be a little bit confusing. I'm going to talk about these three in some depth, and I'm going to sort of highlight because it's kind of small, I've made them each larger. So according to this theory, so all mammals share this autonomic nervous system, and the system is guided by the body's internal unconscious perception of levels of safety or threat. And the system is geared to function adaptively, shifting from one state to another. Okay, so to go among these. So the system has three principal states. So you've got relaxation, also called the social engagement system or the ventral vagal. You've got the mobilized system, which is also called the sympathetic nervous system. And you've got the immobilized system, which he also calls the dorsal vagal system. Even though, as you see, the overlap in this Venn diagram is there can be two states going on in a hybrid. So let's look at each one of these three. So the default state, and it's important to remember, the default state is to be relaxed. And the fact that it's also called the social engagement system gets back to what David just said about the social nature of being human. So this is our default state. It's to be connected. And to be connected, we need to be relaxed. So it's characterized by normal heart rate and muscle tone, and its associated emotions are feeling relaxed, curious, engaged, creative, and hopeful, and other things. But those are some examples. The relaxed state can be more mobilized, so you can get it into a state of play, dance, sports, or performance, or it can be more immobilized, things like being quiet or being in intimacy. So I want to say that we identify this relaxed state broadly with a felt sense of well-being, since it occurs when the body unconsciously perceives a high level of safety and a low level of threat. So when you're under threat, the body shifts into one of those other states, mobilization or immobilization. But when the threat is no longer there, we return to relaxation. Okay, and so we can say that when we return to feeling to relaxed, that the threat has been integrated. So we're no longer stuck there. So the remaining two states, mobilization and immobilization, we go back here, we see they occur in one way when we're feeling safe and another way when we're feeling unsafe. So let's look at them more detailed. So the state of being mobilized is characterized by increased heart rate, muscle tension, and hormone flow. Under safe conditions, we feel energetic, playful, and motivated. Under threat, we feel anxious, fearful, angry, and in flight. Okay, if we go to the mobilized state, it's characterized by decreased heart rate, muscle tension, and hormone flow. And when we're feeling safe, the emotions can feel like things like blissful, meditative, or dreamy. When we're feeling under threat, the emotions can feel depressed, hopeless, and low energy. So that's a quick overview of this theory. So what am I going to do? My broad aim is to consider the capacity of biblical creation imagery for engaging emotions in ways that cultivate a felt sense of well-being. And my specific aim is to point out how this understanding, there can be a problem that shows up with the autonomic nervous system, and I want to look at one way of addressing it. So what is the problem? The problem is that, as just noted, this autonomic nervous system is designed to return to relaxation when a threat is no longer present. But the problem is that return may not actually happen because prior experiences of unsafety that overwhelmed the nervous system may have caused the system to become stuck in or prone to return to mobilized or immobilized states of threat when there is actually no threat. Moreover, experiences of overwhelmed threat have often become linked to largely unconscious negative assumptions or narratives that persist and become filters of experience that lead to exaggerated unconscious perceptions of threat and so prevent the body from returning to a state of relaxation. Here, the effects of the prior threat remain unintegrated. So think about ancient Jews who experienced overwhelming violation, whether at the hands of the oppressive empires or more powerful members of their own community, and the biblical expressions that show up of hopelessness, isolation, abandonment, betrayal, all of these that capture what it would have been to be in a persistent, internalized narratives of unsafety. So to address this problem, that one process, and there are other processes, but one process for integrating the effects of the prior threat and restoring the body to the default state of relaxation involves these three key elements. First, this process involves drama, okay? The drama is like the creation drama that Levinson describes. But while he focuses on the belief that the Jewish obedience to Torah moves God to engage the drama and defeat the threat, the process I'm describing focuses on how liturgically enacting the drama of creation imagery activates the nervous system experientially and emotionally, evoking something like the originating state of threat by means of imagery or narrative, so that the nervous system becomes briefly activated and associated with that prior threat. And thus, if you think about it, this process can't be accomplished by simply analytic reasoning or telling a story in an emotionally distanced way. Second, the context of that dramatic enactment must feel safe and include one or more people who feel empathetic and safe to the person. So here again, this is the sporadically social nature of what it is to be human. We enact these texts in a context with other people who feel safe. Third, and this is key, the process works by using the moment of activated threat in a safe context to decouple the bodily state of threat from the internalized threatening image or narrative that's linked to the past experience, and then to replace them with new imagery and narrative that feels safe and connected. In normal circumstances, images of existing natural creation presented as order and safe have some capacity to activate the state of relaxation, and so associate that state with the narrative of God as the one who established harmonious creation and so is worthy of trust and loyal obedience. When the nervous system is stuck in a state of threatened mobilization or immobilization linked to prior threatening experience, I suggest the utility of contextualizing that threatening creation image with safe ones. The threatening images can activate the person's threatened state linked to the negative narrative, while doing so in a safe liturgical context where the old threat is not actually present, opens the possibility of unlinking the threatened bodily state from the old narrative and drawing the body emotionally into a new narrative that feels safe, allowing the body to return to relaxation, hence well-being. So two common biblical patterns of this sort of contextualization are the interpretation of past devastations as divine punishment, while contextualizing that punishment within a larger trajectory leading to a renewed relationship with God linked to safety, for example, new creation in Deutero-Isaiah. And the interpretation of the violating agent, whether specified or not, being punished or neutralized by God, resulting in renewed safety, so a proper state of creation. I also note the importance of awe for helping the body in its process of letting go of the stuck, threatened state and shifting to a relaxed context. Both Levinson and David highlight awe as an emotion that leads to the broadening of one's perspective, which is precisely what the nervous system needs when stuck in a negative narrative of threat. So elsewhere, and you can see the bibliography, I have discussed Isaiah's ambiguous use of the bodily image of trembling, both to capture the audience's sense of threat linked to an old threatening narrative and to shift that narrative to one that invites safety linked to the narrative of God's unfolding, saving action. So finally, 3 concluding observations. First, the fundamental binary that guides the autonomic nervous system to shift among states is safety versus threat. And that binary maps onto the binary present in biblical imagery of creation and order versus evil and chaos, and to its corollary in the liturgical imagery and activity of praise and life versus lament and death. Second, in David's discussion, we find creation imagery that evokes safety and connection, Mount Zion as mother, trees that rejoice, as well as threat, drowning in waters, dying of drought. He consistently demonstrates how bare images do not work alone, how the biblical text links natural images with bits of narrative that shape the image's evocative capacity. Waters can refresh or drown. Fields of vegetation may blossom and thrive, or wither and die. Finally, grateful to David for demonstrating so well the emotionally evocative character of a wide range of creation imagery, I want to underscore the vital importance of actualizing that imagery in liturgy, in socially connected spaces that are felt to be safe so that the hearers can more readily allow their bodies to access stuck places of threat that they may carry, and in that way to be helped to return to bodily felt sense of safety. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. Again, some very compelling thoughts and should make for a great discussion. We are now going to take a brief 5-minute break, Joshua.
Yes.
Allow David to collect his thoughts, and he will come back and allow David to respond to Dick and Christopher's comments, and then we'll open up for a broader discussion. So we will resume at 10:50. Is that good?
That sounds great.
All right. Thank you all. We'll see you soon. Are we ready?
I believe we are.
Okay. Well, welcome back, everyone. We are ready to resume our discussion. So we will move first to David and allow him to respond to Dick and Christopher's comments. And then we will give a few minutes to allow Dick and Christopher to perhaps respond back to David. And then we'll open up for our audience discussion. Okay, David, so I'll turn it over to you.
All right. And something that struck me early as Dick first started speaking of a question I never thought of, like what discontent it leads an author to write a book. It's an interesting question. And as I think of my discontent, as partly that's the disconnect of creation emotion. I see a lot of what's happening in the field in creation, sort of on the umbrella of like sort of environmental ethics type stuff, and not, I guess, the more, I guess, sort of traditional descriptive theology of creation is found in the Bible. And I missed that. So I've seen some things, for example, arguments that the ancient Israelites were animists, but I don't find persuasive. I mean, maybe they were, maybe they weren't. I can't go back and ask them. But the arguments in favor of them being animist are basically, well, they personified nature. And if that's the criterion, then we're all animists. So I found certain discontent, I guess, with the way that creation is sort of getting talked about currently in ways that I appreciated the way it had been talked about, say, in the 90s by people like Dick Clifford. So I'm going to bring back that way of thinking about creation and then connect it into emotion. And emotion is getting talked about a lot, but without much reference to place or to circumstance. So I thought, I guess, a certain discontent in both areas, and that what was needed was sort of to bring them together or to combine them. I I didn't talk about the story in the story of Eden, partly because it didn't really occur to me, and partly because if it had occurred to me, I would have thought, well, it's been done to death. I would have avoided it anyway. But I'm struck with kind of your description of as God is responding to what God is seeing. And part of what that resonated for me was that the work I'm doing in cognitive linguistics is related to work by a man named Michael Tomasello, who is for decades basically studied chimpanzees and humans. And he's developed a notion of, his question was, what happened, evolutionarily speaking, over 6 million years to separate the common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees to create what we are? That was what happened evolutionarily to make us. And to simplify, just what happens is we are able to form what he calls a shared or collective intentionality, that I can have an intention to do something and understand that you have an intention. We can have the same intention. Right? So we go to like a Catholic mass to have the same intention, what's going to happen here, and we can cooperate in that intention. We can each regulate our individual behavior in order to cooperate in a shared goal or shared intention or shared sense of meaning. And that's what makes culture possible. So as you're talking about, God is sort of responsive to humans, that God is, how to put this, in that game of shared intentionality, in that place of, so we as humans are kind of reading each other's minds in some respects, understanding each other's intentions, or trying to, so that we can regulate our own behaviors and be the social creatures that we're desperately trying to be. And that God is doing that too, right? And I was struck to just the way Dick expressed it, that God reveals something about God's self when God creates such extraordinarily emotional, social, relational creatures as humans. And that is that part of what it means to be made in the image of God, is that sociality, that relationality. And I sometimes talk to my students who are, much more, I guess, versed in the traditional ways of thinking of God as not emotional, that's a terrible idea. And to say that there's our brains work in different ways. There's a famous book, Thinking Fast and Slow. That way, sort of one way of thinking that's sort of very quick, intuitive, and emotional, and another way of thinking that is very slow and deliberate. We can trace our steps. It's more logical. And I think for many of us, we do both of those things, and they don't always cohere. So the example I give them is that, a theologian might have theologically correct opinions about God's impassibility and lack of emotion, but resorts or falls back on the image of a father figure in the sky who grants favors when suddenly their child is in the hospital. But we sort of use both of these. And a lot of our systematic theology is that slow, deliberative thinking, but a lot of our lived experience and relationship with God is that fast, intuitive, and emotional thinking. So I just first started at thinking more than I had before, I guess, about those creation narratives in early Genesis and what that suggests about gods and humans and relationship between the two in connection with creation. To come to Dick's latter point about the polarities in the chapters, the short answer is that those polarities are something that the editor wanted because they thought, I guess their experiences, people are more drawn to a book that has something like 5 chapters as opposed to 10, right? So just reducing the scale. And some of the chapters that say that do make sense as polarities and some did not. So the ones that didn't, like surprise, fear, can kind of go together, but they don't have to. Same thing with disgust and anger can go together, but they don't have to. And joy and awe could be discussed together, but they don't have to. But the other 2 chapters, one on love, the first one on love and grief, really belong together in the sense that grief makes no sense without love. I think it's sort of, so I think I said somewhere that grief is the price we pay for love. And it kind of comes down to a common, what psychologists call attachment theory, just sort of the way we understand, way modern scientists understand love and grief. It's the same exact theory. They come down to the same exact thing. So they're like flip sides of the same coin. And if you never loved anyone, then you would never experience grief. And part of what I find compelling about grief as an experience is that you might think that, oh, you're in sort of a, especially in the West, you might tend to think of ourselves we're adults, we're independent, autonomous agents, and we don't really depend on other people, or it's somehow childish or shameful to depend on other people. But the moment that someone you love dies, or you learn is going to die, you feel this grief that is a visceral reminder that you're not as independent and autonomous as you thought you were, that you need this person, that maybe you didn't realize that you needed this person until suddenly they're gone or almost gone. And so that's a way in which love and grief just go together or belong together. And the same thing sort of with pride and shame, just because they're both, you can almost think of sort of one mechanism, so to speak. People often describe it like a barometer, that pride and shame are like a social barometer in which your emotions are trying to read your social status in the community. So if you feel like you're doing well and people like you and you're respected and you have this sense of pride and you're sort of upright and things are all's right with the world. And then if things go terribly wrong or people think bad things about you, then you feel instead a sense of shame of sort of spiraling downward. And those emotions are kind of like a barometer. It's very important to us as social creatures to have a good standing in our communities. And so those emotions of pride and shame are feeding into us a little bit of information about where, as far as we can tell, where do we stand in the social order? What is our reputation like? And so it seems that pride and shame might go together for that reason. But the other pairs in the chapters, I don't think don't really have to go together in the same way. And in terms of to Chris's remarks, I'm reminded eventually it's like the vagal theory, and I checked my book quickly because I didn't cite Borges on the polyvagal theory, but I did somewhere, some other book I cited him. And part of, and think of that polarities of emotion, and partly you described these 3 states, right, of the sort of relaxed, safe social engagement, which you might think of like a default. That's where you want to be. It's where you want to live your life. And that state of being sort of mobilized or immobilized is less desirable, sort of a departure from a kind of homeostasis. And in some ways, the polarities can reflect this. If love is that sense of that safe place, and then grief is this sort of unsafe, I guess, immobilization. I mean, grief is sort of 2 parts of it. The times where sort of feel depressed, hopeless, and immobilized and sad, and everything slows down. And other times in grief, we might be very angry and very mobilized. But the point is that both of those experiences are unpleasant parts of grief, where we would like to just be relaxed in the happy place of love. And you got me think what biblical writers are doing varies, right? So sometimes a biblical writer might be addressing an audience that the writer perceives as happy. You know, like I think of like Amos talk about the day of the Lord, or almost any prophet talk about the day of the Lord. But Amos is very clear that you, his audience, you think that the day of the Lord is going to be a great day for you. You think that it's going to be a wonderful day. But I, Amos, am here to tell you it's going to be an awful day for you. You're going to be surprised at how bad it is. And he has images like, the day of the Lord is like a man comes home, the safety of home, leans his hand against the wall, just a gesture of being at home, and then is bitten by a snake. That's going to be the day of the Lord. You think it's safe. You think you're safe, but you're not. And so he's trying to move people out of their sense of safety into a sense of fear. Terrible things are going to happen to you because you're living in grievous sin and you don't even see it. You become so complacent in your wickedness that you will experience God's judgment. And as a prophet, my job is to tell you that you're in trouble when you feel like you're not. Or like Jeremiah complaining about people who say peace, peace, when there is no peace, trying to get people out of their comfort zone or out of their feeling that they're safe. Then you've got other contexts, other prophets, and Second Isaiah occurred to me as an example of one who is, Second Isaiah taken to be addressing exiles in Babylon. And there's a lot of different exiles in Babylon who feel different things. Some of them have, built homes, planted vineyards, or whatever. They're pretty comfortable. But there's some that this prophet is addressing that he understands to be very broken, depressed, despondent, hopeless people, and he's trying to evoke in them a sense of awe and a promise that these current events, the collapse of Babylon, the imminent collapse of Babylon, will mean that we can go home, that this is God's doing. And you've all sort of experienced the ritual, the holiday of Passover. There's a new Passover coming, a new Exodus, and it's going to be wonderful. And he's trying to motivate people out of that sense of hopelessness and that feeling that there is no future for us, and trying to get them to see there is a future for you, trying to destroy their, I guess, negative conceptions about their hopelessness and get them to see something more positive. And it's that population of people, I think, that then are motivated to migrate. Because if you're happy in Babylon, you just stay there. But he's addressing an audience of people who must be unhappy enough that they would like to leave. The prospect he paints of a restoration in Jerusalem sounds good enough that they're willing to basically reverse the deportation and undertake a very significant and difficult journey back to a city that they know is in ruins. They're not even going back to a city that's built. They have to go back and rebuild it. So I'm struck in terms of the polarities that you can understand, especially as you can sort of understand the emotion that the prophet or the writer is trying to evoke in people. You get a sense of those three sort of categories of, safe, mobilized or immobilized. Where does the prophet think the audience is, and where are they trying to move that audience? From the despondence of the exiles into a more hopeful, let's go home kind of restoration, or like Amos, moving them from complacency in their wickedness and trying to shift them toward fear, to repent and change the way they live. And sort of finally with this, I think that's often overlooked that Chris touches on, to sort of the ways in which people sort of make sense out of past disasters. And one of those ways is the disaster is divine punishment. And I think oftentimes we are reluctant to take the biblical language seriously, that catastrophes could be a divine punishment, because it sounds like that's an awful, terrible God who did these terrible things. And we don't perhaps appreciate the extent to which what makes trauma traumatic is the helplessness. And you can feel less helpless if you feel more in control. And by saying it's somehow my fault is a way of claiming control over the events that happened to you. If you can find a way that somehow you're responsible for the catastrophe that happened to you, that can help you cope with that trauma because you have a sense of control over it. And I think often, particularly if we feel comfortable, we might undervalue how important it may be for other people to latch onto a sense of control, even if it means a sense of guilt. That guilt can be useful, in other words. And similarly, we moderns tend to react negatively against this sort of very vengeful, violent God. And again, maybe because we're too comfortable, that there's ways in which the agent who is responsible for your misery, the idea that God will severely punish that agent brings relief, right? That can move you again out of that sense of safety, of unsafety, of fear and anxiety into a more safe space or safe state. If you feel like God has your back, that God is going to avenge your enemies. And think again of second Isaiah, who's trying to turn an audience around from their despondency towards a hope for the future. And part of that hope isn't just the Persians are going to let us go home. Part of that hope is the fall of Babylon, right? You're depicting Babylon as this arrogant, prideful empire that's going to be cast down by God and punished severely because of what they did to you, right, to us. And Babylon in its arrogance exceeded what God wanted to do. So you have kind of both things happening. That catastrophe happened because God willed it to happen as a punishment, but Babylon got carried away and became more severe than God intended. And so now Babylon is going to be punished. So you could have both things work at the same time, sort of a divine punishment at work and divine punishment of the agent who did the terrible thing. And both of those things are happening in Second Isaiah. So I thank both Chris and Dick for the sort of thoughtful feedback. So they give me more to think about, especially as I keep working on these areas of like human emotion, sociality, and anthropology. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, David. So if Dick or Christopher wants to make any kind of a response, now's the time, or we will open it up to our audience.
Well,
Unmute.
Dick, go ahead, Dick.
I just wanted to, it raises the question. This is really not David's purview, but it raises the question of God, of emotions in God, since God makes the world and so on. Why are the virtues or the emotions attributed to God, divine anger, compassion, and so on? What are we to make of those? Because the view that most people's view of God, and at least in the Christian tradition, has been that God is impassible, omniscient, and omnipotent. And yet the Bible God is none of those, really. I mean, God is not impassible in that God shows great emotions. God is not omniscient because he has to learn by watching the man in the Garden of Eden, among other instances, and learning to adapt according to the nature of this fascinating and mercurial being that God has brought into being without really knowing the full range of human activity. And so I just wondered, it opens it up, but I don't ask anybody here for the next 5 years to say anything of great significance about it. But it does raise, to me, what are we to make of the divine emotions that God is portrayed as having in the Bible? Because once you say humans have emotions, who the heck, the one who made them must also, in some way, be emotionally touched as well. It's a question that I don't expect an answer to.
Yeah, it's good because I don't really have an answer, but I touched on this briefly at the end of an article I wrote on the tears of God in Jeremiah. So in Jeremiah, God weeps, and commentators like Jerome had no problem with that. Could acknowledge God weeps in Jeremiah, in part because he just at the time that Jerome is writing, nobody thinks that God really has emotion, right? So he can accept this language as just sort of language. And then in the more modern era, and with Septuagint for that matter too, you have more resistance, right? Of more, oh, that's not God crying, that's the prophet. But I think it is God crying. I think I don't have like I have a good solution, but meant for my reference like thinking fast and slow, that our slow, deliberative, rational, sort of systematic theological thinking gives us this impassibility, but our fast, intuitive, emotional thinking gives us a much more emotional and relational God. And that doesn't give us a unified theory of how this all fits together, but it does, it's not helpful to tell people, in effect, I guess the systematically, theologically correct thing, that prayer doesn't change God. It's like banging your head against a wall. The wall is the same, your head is transformed. That's not a very motivating image of prayer. I think people pray because they believe they can change the mind of God, change the will of God, and therefore change outcomes. And that's why I mentioned the example of be a theologian and may have a very theologically correct view, about God's impassibility or whatever, but that view goes out the window in an emergency. And I don't know what to do with those polarities, but
Good thing, yeah.
I have some thought on this, and I don't want to just, I mean, this gets into something I've been chewing on for quite a while, and that's, putting together the radical mystery of God. Ultimately, you can't, in some sense, everything we say about God is by way of metaphor, that ultimately God is mystery. So we have the things we say of God, yet there's always an unknowability of God. So this kind of brings me back to what is the actual felt truth of the thing you say. And this comes, what I was just saying, if human beings were built for human connection, and that's our nervous systems are. So to say that God is angry on my behalf helps me to feel like I can trust God. Because I think ultimately it's about, do I trust God or not? Do I let go to the mystery of who God is or not? And that these stories help us to be able to trust God. And if I can imagine God who's standing up for me when I've been violated, then that helps me to shift to my sense of it's safe. I can be engaged. And because we're built as social creatures, we can't, it's why it's so strong to imagine God as socially, imagine God as someone who has emotions like we do, because that's what we need. We need to do that so that we can that's kind of what my reflection is, that, and then it rings true with us. It rings true with our nervous systems. It rings true in our bodies. And when we reflect and when we go quiet, that yes, this I can trust. And ultimately are these images of God as, angry at my enemies, or as someone who's going to fight for me, who's going to help me, that I can have confidence that God will respond to this. At the same time, that it's really all about the construction of meaning, that it's relational. And this is something you've already said, David, that God, it's a highly relational construction. And this is, again, Dick, what you were saying about the whole creation in the ancient Near East. It's all relational. The created world is a relational world. It's a communal world. So all the way we talk about it needs to really retain this relationality. And it's all really about, can I really trust? But what keeps me from trusting is kind of what I was talking about. When deep down inside I get stuck in a place of unsafety, I can't trust because of something inside me says it's not safe. So I have to pull back. I have to pull, and the constructions around God become, I'm afraid of God. I can't. So I think it's kind of, that we understand God as responding to our prayer. We understand God as having emotions on our behalf, and helping us to work through our loss and our grief, and so that because that's how we're built and that's what we need. Realizing that it's not preserving the notion of God's ultimate mysteriousness, that pretty much everything we say is in some sense metaphoric. So that's kind of how I deal with it.
I was mentioning quickly as you were talking, I was thinking of even like biblical writers may evoke or present God in some very relational way for various purposes, to draw you one way or another. And even when God, say in 2nd Isaiah, is presented as very transcendent, even that very transcendent God is not quite unemotional, because that God is engaged in Israel, still relational. So it seems that even when you think of images of God, say in the Bible, that approach that kind of transcendent, impassible God, don't really get there, because an impassible God just doesn't sound like the God you read about.
Great. I think we have a question from Karina Hogan that I believe Joshua is going to read for her.
Yeah, thank you very much. Karina Hogan typed in the chat. I haven't read David's book yet, but it sounds fascinating. Building on Christopher's presentation, how much do you address the bodily experience of emotions, David? Especially as you draw on cognitive linguistics, which is grounded in bodily experience.
Say how much, I don't know, some. could potentially be more, and probably there's more of it in the footnotes probably than in the text. The place that leaps to mind with the cognitive linguistics and embodied cognition are most salient is the discussion of pride and shame, a sort of verticality scheme of it. Pride is up, shame is down, like power is up, powerlessness is down. And that's part of a sort of a fairly cross-cultural mapping, because as not only are we social creatures, we're also creatures that live in a world with gravity. So we have this up and down. And as we gather things or fill vessels, more of something is up, fills it up. And so that kind of embodied experience translates into how we conceptualize things like power or certain emotions. And even emotions have volume, so to speak. You can be more angry or less angry. You might map that into up or down. But that comes through most clearly in the pride and shame chapter. I mentioned in places that all of these emotions have sort of related physiology that I sometimes mention, sometimes don't, because physiology is not always surfacing in the text. But like the elevated, heart rate of the mobilized state is something that you will sometimes see. I've forgotten exactly where early in Jeremiah he's talking about his heart beating wildly, right? And it's one of the few places where the Hebrew word for heart actually means heart. It doesn't seem to mean, mind, emotion, or will. And so you occasionally, that, I guess, the physiology of emotion occasionally surfaces, but for the most part, the writers are trying to manipulate, so to speak, or influence your emotion physiology in these ways without necessarily naming the emotion, and certainly without describing the physiology. But then if they're using creation to do it, that's automatically embodied. So creation is place, and we exist in places. And so if you'll see it in, I guess the embodiedness will come up in things like there's some discussion of darkness, and just our human visual perceptual system is such that at a certain threshold, we just can't see anything anymore. And when we can't see anything, we become afraid because we can't move, or you're sort of immobilized by the fact that you can't see what there is around you. You might walk off a cliff, or who knows. So all of this sort of language about creation used to shape emotion is very much drawing on embodied experiences. And even all, like in Second Isaiah, trying to do this through things like, and in Job also, it's kind of a two-step comparison of, how small you are compared to a mountain. And a mountain's like a grain of sand to God, right? So you already feel small in front of the mountain, and now with that second step comparison, you feel very tiny. Again, very embodied experience. Job also has God speaking, the book of Job, God talks about like tables, filling vessels, again, very embodied human familiar experiences, but then they're scaled up. Say what to you is a familiar experience of like moving a table, for God, that's the entire earth. So I guess as I think about it, I don't always draw out the point, but all of this creation language is sort of necessarily embodied. And there are places where I guess I make that more explicit, like with the darkness or some of the two-step comparisons. And if I don't like the darkness, just because it's embodied, or the up-downness of pride and shame is embodied, it tends also to be cross-cultural, that it's not just a culturally specific thing, but because it's embodied, and all humans have bodies, and all humans have a similar visual system, darkness is a common fear among children, and often not only children, across cultures. So I guess as I try to think what the question means and answer it, I think you'll find embodied stuff, especially if you just sort of realize that when you're reading about physical creation, you're reading about embodied experience. And then other places, the embodiedness will be much more to the front of the discussion.
Great. I have a question. I'm not quite sure how to word it though. It's kind of a mix of between something that Chris said and what David said. So I'll try to piece this together, but I'm not sure it'll come out right. So Chris talked about a prior threat. A prior threat will cause someone to be stuck in a state of threat, right? And that leads to being in an unsafe, persistent state, or unsafe assumption, making unsafe assumptions and causing unsafe narratives in that person's life. or so. Okay, so that's the setting. And then David, I think you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you had mentioned that at some point that using one emotion can cause someone to be snapped out of other emotions that are perhaps negative, to bring them out of that state of despondency or negative emotions that other emotions are used to snap them out of that, to bring them to a state of I don't know, joy and awe or something like that. I think that's where you were talking about it, but so would those two kind of work together to get the person out of that state of feeling the threat? Um, am I making any sense?
No, and I'll probably let Chris speak to this as well. But I mean, to draw a very non-biblical example, it's possible some people maybe have kids like I do, and you've seen Inside Out 2, the movie. It's to me one of the more striking scenes is towards the end when anxiety is sort of in full control of Riley. So in this movie, these emotions are sort of like personified homunculi inside the mind that control a person. And anxiety has sort of control, and this girl's going to have like a panic attack and a complete sort of meltdown. And what finally ends that is that Joy is able to kind of break through and stop anxiety from controlling everything. And to mind, those sort of a good example, I guess, or illustration of the power of emotions like joy and awe to undo negative affect, a negative emotion. As the other examples of it is even more obscure. There's a book published forever ago called The Abused God. It then had this essay by a woman who was raped when she was a teenager and writing this essay responding to Psalm 27. And as she's responding to it and writing, towards the end, you could see places where she's just very angry about what happened to her. And then at the end, she's thinking about the created world, about running through sprinklers, just little bits of joy in day-to-day life, and expressing a willingness to participate in a process of healing, which struck me sort of, there's an example of somebody who's finding little joyous things in day-to-day life that make it possible to endure in life, continue living, healing in the wake of terrible catastrophe. So sort of different ways of construing or understanding how positive emotions can undo negative emotions or draw us out of, like, a negative emotion could just cause you to focus your full attention on your problems. And so when God talks to Job and trying to draw his attention out of his problems and into the universe, and just people endure and survive and are resilient to the extent that they can tap into those more positive emotions, they can focus on other people. Plenty of people who have suffered grievously often find a sense of mission, something that somewhat using their pain to help other people. And I guess the example I give my students are Amber Alerts. So you may or may not know that Amber Alerts are named after a girl named Amber, who was kidnapped and murdered, and her parents spent the rest of their lives kind of getting states to initiate these Amber Alerts, which now exist internationally and have saved several thousand children. And that was a way that they took their pain and developed a mission and a way of coping with their pain through that mission, something hopeful. And again, Chris, I want to speak more to this, but I think this.
Yeah, thank you, David. I mean, it's a great question, and I think what David's response is certainly, that is an important way that people can move forward in little ways. I think the key thing to keep in mind is the complexity of who we are as human beings, that there can be so much going on at the same time inside of us. And there are people who have gone through, I mean, what I do now every day is I work with adults who are childhood trauma survivors. And you really see how different moments, different things can be going on. And people can still enjoy life and have moments of joy, yet there can be persistent, deep narratives that show up in certain times under certain situations, certain cues, bring up stuckness. So we just have to keep in mind the complexity that certain ways just putting yourself in a joyful place can enliven you, that I think of Gary Anderson's book on expressions of grief and joy, and how his point was just being in the celebration produces the emotion in some level. At the same time, I think what I was trying to really emphasize was there can be these deep under the surface, unconsciously held things because of particularly strong moments of stress or threat, like that we would call trauma, that leave a kind of persistent proclivity or predisposition to go into a state of threat or something that really keeps us. And I think for dealing with that, like come back to Job, I think that's what's beautiful about Job is you walk through his whole experience of overwhelm and you acknowledge the existence of it. So somebody reading the book can maybe identify with the various kinds of overwhelm that he experienced. And then, but that can be brought into relationship with God and could be brought into a place of being recognized and being respected and being safe. And even though, again, in that sense of awe, that is that transition. Like you have fear, but it's a lot acknowledged. You create a space in which the person can then use the awe becomes this hinge to get into, oh yeah, this, but God controls, God is there with the awe. I associate that's beyond what I can grasp. So it's really, it's kind of this complexity. And I was looking at sort of the deeper unconscious things and how those can need to be addressed. So I think on the one hand, to summarize it, we don't want to think too simplistically in terms of, well, if I'm feeling sad, all I need to do is do something joyful and I'll be better. That can help, but it won't necessarily deal with the deeper things that I may be carrying.
Great, thank you both for really good answers. I think we have a couple of questions in the chat, Josh.
Yeah, there's a few questions. I'll read one. Gregory Bloomquist had wanted to follow up on a comment that you had made. Is it darkness that is feared, or is it being deprived of something, an example, light, that causes an emotion that is fear? For example, does a blind person live in fear? I don't think so. Might this deprivation feature be why polarities are important?
Yeah, about the polarities part at the end, I'm gonna have to think more about, but certainly it is the deprivation that's the issue. So no, I don't think blind people live in fear. I don't think the ancient writers think that. It is much more that, why, you're just like, why is it so common that people are afraid of the dark? And the short answer seems to be, from people who study this, darkness inhibits movement. You can't see what's there. The child's afraid of the monster under the bed or in the closet. The darkness obscures your perception of the environment. So you feel safe in part because you know what's around you. And in darkness, you don't know what's around you. Who knows what creepy crawlies might emerge in the night? You walk in the kitchen, flip on a light, and see cockroaches scatter. That's spooky. It's creepy, right? It's that darkness conceals things that are frightening in various ways. And darkness constrains our ability to move. And if you are blind, or if you live in northern Norway and you're accustomed to extended periods of darkness, it's different, right? You're not afraid if you're accustomed to navigating the world that way anyway. We might all be afraid of, say, losing an arm or becoming paralyzed because we don't know how we could live like that. But there are people who live like that. But for those of us who can see and depend on our vision to navigate the world, darkness is scary, or can be scary. So yeah, it is very much about deprivation.
I'll pose two questions if that's okay. I have one for myself, and then Catherine Brown just posted one as well. I really appreciate your book and reading through things. I especially appreciated when you're talking about emotion in the introduction. It said emotion terms evoke the conceptual content related to the emotion. I was thinking about how I might introduce this to my students in my history of theology class or history of Christianity class, where reader response theory seems to have taken hold. That they deal with this assumption that I'm spiritual, I'm not religious, and the meaning of emotion and texts are in some way based in the community or based in the interpreter themselves and not in the text itself. As I was reading and thinking about your book, I was wondering how you might respond to that in modern approaches. In some communities, where the meaning of the text is actually in the community or the individual reader. And I'm posing this question because the nature of emotions would change then based on that. And so I'm thinking about how I might transition this into one of my classrooms and wanted to pose that up as a point of discussion. Would you like the second question, or do you want to deal with that first?
I'll try to deal with that for sure. Right better on that one. I think it's take back to the beginning, the first part you were saying in terms of words, expressions, evoking concepts in the mind. Just a way of thinking of how does language mean, and it's not that words carry bundles of meaning. There's lots of so I tend to avoid the word refer to because words don't refer to things; they gesture toward concepts in the mind. And as you grow up in a culture, you have experiences, including experiences of language, and that's how you learn what people mean by certain kinds of words. What are they gesturing toward? So you develop a concept, say, of anger because you've experienced it, you've seen it, you've heard this word anger associated with those experiences. You've heard lectures about the causes and consequences of anger, the ethics surrounding it, and all of that is sort of your encyclopedic knowledge. Everything you know about anger is evoked when you just hear the word anger. But of course, not all of that is brought online. So somebody might be talking about anger or eliciting ideas about anger, tapping into that conceptual world, and then highlighting certain elements of that, certain elements of your knowledge over others. So that's, I mean, in terms of, I guess sort of that's how language is working. And as far as the reader response, there's a way in which in a linguistic community, there's a certain level of agreement about what the concepts are that words are gesturing toward. The problem is we all had different experiences growing up. We all, not even within the same culture, within the same community, we have different experiences. And so a lot of miscommunication happens in part because we're using words in different ways or slightly different senses. I remember once at an SBL meeting, I forget what the context was, because somebody was standing up to ask a question and they had understood emotion to be an extreme sort of reaction, right? That for this person, emotion had to be a very, very, very strong emotion, whereas others think that emotion can be something much more subtle. But just things like that. Do you think that emotion has to be in a massive upheaval of thought, or can emotion be something much more lower level? And to come to the question of how the students will think of this, language is about communication. For that reason, I'm personally unwilling to just completely relinquish any notion of sort of author intent, because how frustrating would it be to talk to somebody who doesn't care at all about what you're trying to say, right? There seems that there's sort of an ethical need to be attentive or concerned about what this person means when they speak, so that if you're listening to a British person talk and they reference corn, you should know that they mean something different by what you as an American might think corn is. And that's going to be a misunderstanding if you don't get that straight. So you have to make a certain amount of effort to understand where the other person is coming from, to understand their language or to ask questions. That said, at the end of the day, whatever understanding you have, those words are evoking something in your mind. And so I'm certainly not going to say, well, as much as I think author intention matters or meaning resides partly in what authors and writers are trying to do, meaning also resides in the text itself and it resides in the reader. It's a question of, my concern is that if you just put all the weight of meaning just in reader response, it strikes me as sort of, frankly, lazy and self-indulgent. You need to work a little bit harder to understand what other people mean when they're talking. Otherwise, you will constantly misunderstand, miscommunicate, and nobody will like you, and you'll have no friends because you are shown a complete inability or disregard to read the minds and intentions of other people. And I didn't touch on this topic. There's a whole area that I'm sure Chris can elaborate on, like theory of mind and mentalization, where as social creatures, we're constantly trying to figure out what other people are thinking and feeling, what motivates them. And the better we are at doing that, the more accurate we are as mind readers, the better our lives tend to get, the better our relationships are. And if we really suck at those skills, then our relationships are going to be pretty bad. And then our lives are going to be pretty bad. So I just caution against sort of retreat into reader response, because it's a retreat. It's you're retreating into yourself and just going to be alone.
Can I just tag one quick comment just in line with what David just said? I think that just building on what you just said, David, if we're thinking Bible, that for people in faith communities, the Bible is curated and mediated through a faith community that stands kind of like, what is this bringing us? So there is a communal dimension to how we experience it, and that's part of the communication. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Very good. Thank you for that answer. The next question comes from Catherine Brown. God's speech from the whirlwind in Job also describes the experience of joy in creation, those singing morning stars. Do you see this as an expression of creation's own emotion, or as a means of eliciting emotion in the human audience? I'm thinking of some of the work, Hilary Marlowe or others, on the ways creation in prophetic texts may be constructed as acting responsively to God's word or will, so that creation becomes a sort of prophetic agent of the Lord. You're muted, David.
I think partly what's happening in passages like that is the emotional responsiveness of creation is cueing you as an audience into what you're supposed to be feeling. So if the stars are rejoicing, that cues Job into what he's supposed to be doing or how he's supposed to be feeling. If the trees are clapping their hands or mountains are singing, that's again clue this is what creation is doing. There's a presumption that you should be doing this too, that you're part of creation. Yeah, so that's my thought. I'm gonna look more at those passages, but it's, by the way, it is those passages also that have sort of influenced people to think maybe these ancient writers were animist, which I don't, again, can't talk to them. I don't know, but I'm just very skeptical. And I remember one author talking about actually that phrase of it is trees clapping their hands in Second Isaiah, and she thought she was trying to wonder how what does it mean to think that way, that trees could rejoice. And my thought was, I checked her bibliography. She hadn't read Dick Clifford and other people have written about creation in the past who could clarify, as Dick did in the beginning, creation is not just the physical world, it's the social cultural world also. So if Israel is being restored, that's good news for creation, or that the social restoration corresponds with the blooming desert and an ecological restoration, the same way that when prophets threaten there's going to be punishment for sin, that punishment is going to include ecological catastrophe. So that if your community is deeply engaged in sin, then the sort of natural ecology you depend on for survival is going to start to come unraveled, which is why, in say in Jeremiah 14, if you're experiencing a drought, you're not just as a modern person afraid for the future, what is this drought going to mean for me or for our community? You're also feeling shame and guilt. This drought is a punishment. These things don't happen for no reason. There's a reason for this drought. So what did we do wrong? And so it evokes a need not, to go to the temple, to petition God, to repent. Right? And that's a different kind of emotional response compared to what most modern people experience. But again, ancient people are experiencing creation or understanding creation differently. And that different understanding leads to different emotional responsiveness. If that makes sense.
Dick, you want to comment at all? No? All right.
Okay, I'll move on to the next question. The next question comes from John Lafferty. And John, I abbreviated your comments a little bit to pose a more direct question. So please comment in the chat if I haven't done justice to what you're asking about here. John alluded to these comments. I appreciate the author's use of the word evocation and evocative. Do you know the article Toward Greater Emotional Accuracy in Psalm Translation? A Focus on the Process of Translation by June F. Dickey, a South African Bible translator. It's about translating emotions for 3 different cultures. I think using connotative language of poetry and story in the Hebrew Bible supports this. It's also about addressing a communal audience in post-traumatic recovery. The later Greek philosophy influence led to intellectual description of God without emotions. But regarding the insight that detached storytelling doesn't engage the audience, I wonder how to help contemporary audiences and individuals engage the stories to evoke emotions in a way that strengthens faith and awe in God's providence and kingdom. You're muted again, David.
I don't, of course, I don't know the article. I was sort of trying to jot that down. Um, I'm trying to think how to distill this question. Um, I think part of the way that it's part of the way that audiences like modern people can come to the text with more, I guess, emotional awareness or sensitivities twofold. Partly just knowing more in general about emotion. Like, I mean, it's strikes me that we don't have a lot of knowledge about it. It's not well circulated. I mean, we have a lot of knowledge about emotion. It's just that it's not well known to people. I think it's part of the interest of things of movies like Inside Out, the first and second one, because it's basic, but the people who created those movies did a little bit of research, and they're trying to present a way of thinking about emotions, particularly ways to help children think about emotions. And part of the reason why that's so important in the grand scheme of things, as I mentioned before, is mentalization. That if you can name, sort of identify, how could I put into words what I'm feeling? How could I put into words what others are feeling? Then your social functioning is going to get much better because you're more able to read people and read yourself. And we're never perfect at this, but we can be better or worse. Um, so people know more about emotion. That's helpful. And then there's an element of painting a picture. So to come back to the previous question, like on sort of reader response, that can be more fruitful if you can get the reader into the mindset of where the audience was, trying to reconstruct for a person or try to explain for a person what might it have been like to be an Israelite living in exile in Babylon, feeling despondent, hopeless about the future, how even things like how the world around you, the Babylonians are trying to explain why did this catastrophe happen to you? They say it's because Marduk is more powerful than Yahweh. That's why it happened to you. And so you're faced with the temptations towards idolatry, the thought that maybe you worship the wrong God, all these ideas floating around. And we can kind of reconstruct a little bit of what the audience is feeling, what their situation is like. If you reconstruct the circumstance to some extent, then to some extent, you can reconstruct what it might be like, feel like to be in that situation. And then the emotional impact of a prophet like Second Isaiah can become more salient. You can understand it better because you've made the effort to understand the audience that the prophet is trying to address. And therefore you might have a responsiveness similar to what the author is trying to evoke.
Great. All right. We have no more questions in the chat, so I think what we're going to do is, unless Christopher or Richard have any more comments. So we're going to give David the last word, and then we will close out our session. So David, any final comments?
Also sort of thanks and gratitude for being here. And I just want to leave you with I guess the thing that most impresses me, and it's come up repeatedly, the social nature of human beings. And I just want to stress, it sounds like such a platitude. I mean, Aristotle said it, humans are social animals. But we can say that in my experiences, people have no idea. I have to teach a class that involves theological anthropology, and I don't use a lot of theology because when I've read theological anthropology, I've been so disappointed that they'll say humans are social, and they just have no idea. And like if these theologians had read some social science, they could communicate much more forcefully, in depth, just how social we are, what it means to say that we are social, and they could help their students connect what they're learning in theology with what they're learning in the social sciences. So I don't know how to, I guess, make that point, to make that stick for you. I'll just say one thing is that we often think that many of us have sort of an internal voice in our heads. Not everybody does, but many people do. And it feels like a very private, intimate thing. Like that's you somehow. That's the core of who you are, that voice in your head. And to realize then that that voice in your head is not really your voice at all. It literally came from outside of your head. The voice or voices in your head are the voices of other people that you have internalized. And we can see it because we can see children talking to themselves and we can see what they're saying. And what they're saying to themselves is what they've been told by adults. And as they get older, they realize you shouldn't be talking to yourself. So they stop, but they're still talking to themselves in their heads. And that's just one striking illustration among many that ourselves, our very sense of self and identity is a social construction because that's how social we are. So as I put it, we are social all the way down.
Great.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, David. I want to thank Dick and Chris for their responses that stirred some really good conversation and some excellent dialogue from our audience as well. And David, thank you for your comments and your great insight to creation and emotion. And also, again, Dick and Chris, for your comments and your insight to this topic. Let's all give them a round of applause. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Excellent. Thank you for being a part of this, and thank you all in the audience for being a part of our Unbound book review. And we look forward to our next one in January at some point.
January 15th with Jenny Grillo.
All right, January 15th with Jenny Grillo, and we look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you all so much. Have a great holiday and a great end of the year. Thank you.